Thank you for your dedication to restoring the constitutional republic, one county at a time. This video is about the recent international public notice and our response to overturning Chevron deference, published by Anna von Reitz on Wednesday, July 3rd, 2024. We begin with an excellent summation by Spike Cohen, which captures the essence of it. In Loper Bright Enterprises v. Raimondo, the Supreme Court overturned a 40-year-old case called Chevron Deference that granted radical levels of power to federal agencies. Spike Cohen at Real Spike Cohen explains this case and its importance. A family fishing company, Loper Bright Enterprises, was being driven out of business because they couldn't afford the $700 per day they were being charged by the NMFS, the National Marine Fisheries Service, to monitor their company. The thing is, federal law doesn't authorize the NMFS to charge businesses for this. They just decided to start doing it in 2013. Why did they think they could get away with just charging people without any legal authorization? Because in 1984, in the Chevron decision, the Supreme Court decided that regulatory agencies were the experts in their field, and the courts should just defer to their interpretation of the law. So for the past 40 years, federal agencies have been able to interpret laws to mean whatever they want, and the courts had to just go with it. It was called Chevron deference, and it put bureaucrats in charge of the country. It's how OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, was able to decide that everyone who worked for a large company had to get the jab or be fired. No law gave them that authority. They just made it up. It's how the ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, was able to decide a piece of plastic was a machine gun. It's how the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, the NRCS, is able to decide that a small puddle is a protected wetland. It's how out-of-control agencies have been able to create rules out of thin air and force you to comply, and the courts had to simply defer to them because they were the experts. Imagine if your local police could just arrest you for any reason, and no judge or jury would determine if you'd actually committed a crime or not. Just off to jail you go. That's what Chevron deference was. It was not only blatantly unconstitutional, it caused immeasurable harm to everyone. Thankfully, it's now gone. We haven't even begun to feel the effects of this decision in the courts. It will be used for years to come to roll back federal agencies, and we'll all be better off for it. And that's why politicians and corporate media are freaking out about it. This above summation adequately describes the impact of this decision on so-called administrative code and all the related Article 1 courts and tribunals in this country. The reign of bureaucratic terror unleashed by the Chevron deference to experts doctrine has been relegated to the dustbin of history, where it belongs, except that such a decision and such a doctrine should have never existed at all. We are well pleased. The various territorial and municipal congresses have been passing off their responsibilities to unaccountable federal agencies since the 1880s, so that faceless, unelected, and largely unaccountable bureaucrats have been writing administrative codes and enforcing them as law for over 100 years, with ever-increasing impunity and corruption. The break in the dam related to this corruption came last year with another Supreme Court case, West Virginia v. EPA, in which the justices reiterated a 100-plus-year-old Tennessee ruling in Norton v. Shelby County, finding that Congress has no ability to shuffle off its legislative powers to other entities. The immediate effect is to gut the administrative court system and defang the various federal and state-of-state franchise agencies. If Congress wants to burden the public, they will have to get down to it and do their own dirty work and take responsibility for it from now on. They will no longer have the agencies to do it all for them, no longer be able to escape their liability by reassigning their role to unelected bureaucrats. The unelected bureaucrats will no longer be able to extend their capricious and autocratic rule, subject only to their own courts. A sigh of relief can be heard across the land. Politically, the court has handed Congress its own head on a platter, and the executive branch, too, while significantly increasing its own power and the power of its subordinate judicial district courts. This one move has its good points and bad points from an American public perspective. The good part is the removal of oppressive bureaucratic and executive powers. The bad part is increased reliance upon courts attached to military judicial districts, which were set up in the wake of the Civil War and which are infamously known as carpetbagger courts. It is doubtful that this judicial district court system was ever legal or lawful in the first place. It was initiated in May of 1865 via the creation of 10 new military districts covering the 11 defeated Confederate states of states and was invoked via non-existent emergency powers. The primary duty of this ersatz judicial district court system was to keep order and collect war reparations. It was only required to provide an appearance of justice, not actual justice. The current action can be viewed as the British territorial government's judicial district court system knocking off their municipal court competition. It can also be viewed as the British territorial government taking a controlling position over the vast federal agency structure created by FDR and all the more than 353-letter and 4-letter municipal agencies created in the 1930s. It can be viewed as a peremptory move by the court to rein in executive power also. There was a reason that FDR created all those federal agencies, and it was simply to enable him to rule as a despot using executive orders to run the entire country. So, the whole Chevron Deference doctrine that has just been overturned was only an extension and proliferation of already existing abuses of power and non-existent authorities that began in the Belle Epoque era after the Civil War, abuses that have continued unabated until now. The first such inroads began with the Pinkerton laws extended to the railroad corporations, allowing them to hire and deploy foreign police contractors in this country, followed by the deployment of U.S. Marshals in the Western Territories formed during and after the Civil War. Then, within 20 years, there began a proliferation of departmental agencies such as the Department of Justice, Inc., and the Department of Defense, Inc., operated as undisclosed territorial government subcontractors to defend and protect the district corporations against the American public at the expense of the American public. It was during this time period from the 1880s to the 1930s that various other government departments and functions were secretly privatized and farmed out to individual privately owned and operated corporations in the business of providing essential government services. It was during this period of time that the Federal Reserve System, Inc. came into being, and the United States Department of the Treasury, Inc., and the Bureau of Land Management, Inc., and the various state-level bureaus of vital statistics came into being. These are all private enterprises secretly and deceptively operating under color of law as if they have legitimate government authority, and all of their assumed powers have rested on the same practice of secondary delegation of powers that has been overturned in the Loper-Bright Enterprises decision. Please note that the International Monetary Fund, Inc. has operated as the United States Department of the Treasury, Inc., and as the United States Treasury, Inc. since 1924. These, in turn, have been acting in concert with the Internal Revenue Service, Inc. These are all British Crown corporations. Meanwhile, the IMF, Inc. has operated as the U.S. Department of the Treasury, Inc., and the United States Treasury, Inc., and United States of America, Inc., and so on. in a similar mirrored bureaucracy having little or nothing to do with this actual country or our people. These are all Holy Roman Empire municipal corporations. It's clear that the overturning of the Chevron Deference doctrine means overturning many of the powers assumed by these incorporated entities and delegalizing many of the enforcement activities that have been used to purloin property interests and illegally confiscate assets belonging to Americans beginning in the 1880s. The so-called executive powers exercised by FDR and his successors to accomplish all these evil ends and to benefit from corporate cronyism are similarly overturned by this decision, in that the executives of the federal municipal corporations can no longer delegate their powers away to these incorporated agencies. Like the territorial and municipal congresses, the presidents are now stuck doing their own dirty work and are liable for the performance and the results. As Americans, we are pleased, but wary. The judicial district court system has its own evil history of abuses, and it is no accident that Americans who can't tell you how many donuts are in a dozen can still remember the phrase, carpetbagger courts. These courts were famous for misaddressing anyone who had anything of value as a rebel or insurrectionist, and then illegally and immorally confiscating their private assets to pay war reparations for a mercenary conflict, which is itself both illegal and unlawful. Should we celebrate this power grab by these judicial courts? Probably not. They are not our courts, and their history in this country is not at all reassuring. From the American perspective, we have been at peace since 1814, and nobody should be misidentifying us as part of any foreign citizenry, impersonating us, accusing us, latching upon our assets, misaddressing us, or otherwise presuming anything against us. From the American perspective, there are no emergency powers nor executive orders and no war powers either. These phrases and everything attached to them pertain to foreign corporations and their internal operations. They have nothing to do with the American public and never did. Untangling this vast web of semantic deceits and misdeeds, breaches of trust, violation of service contracts, and wrongs visited upon the innocent will take time and effort to unravel. We are guardedly optimistic about the recent Supreme Court reversal of the Chevron Deference doctrine. It has many foreseeable good results and is a big step toward restoring sanity both in court venues and in the arena of public administration. Many of the most egregious abuses will be stopped. The effect of further empowering military district judicial courts is unknown and unsettling from the perspective of the civilian population and the American government, which considers the occupation of our country by foreign mercenary forces to be illegal and unlawful, and also considers the basis for forming the so-called judicial district court system to be lacking. A British territorial United States Congress ordained these courts via legislative act in 1865, but that is no excuse to impersonate Americans and subject them to foreign law in breach of trust and service contract. Just as a mercenary conflict does not provide recourse to the law of war. If these infamous courts and those running them can be correctly and sufficiently re-educated, justice may return to this country prior to the broad-spectrum reopening of our assembly courts. This would certainly be welcome, instead of a last-ditch effort to further defraud, brutalize, and mischaracterize Americans on the way out the door, which is the other possible outcome. Millions of Americans have been impersonated as British territorial U.S. citizens and have been illegally presumed upon to pay mortgages and property taxes, which they either 1. Don't owe in the first case, or 2. Owe but not in reference to what is owed to them. A large-scale plan and effort to foreclose on millions of American homeowners and landowners under these false presumptions has been uncovered, and carpetbagger courts brought forward into the modern era would certainly be handy and well practiced in the art of illegal confiscation of assets. It is our position and purpose to oppose any such activities being carried out against our people and against their lawful persons by British territorial mercenary interests or any other parties and players. It can be easily observed and historically documented that Americans don't owe any national debt and don't owe anything to the central banks. Instead, we are the only solvent underwriters. Unlike our Tory neighbors, we didn't borrow any money from King George to fight against ourselves in the War of Independence, nor did we mortgage our lands to pay his successors back for more loans, enabling ourselves to fight for His Royal Britannic Majesty in World War I or World War II, which is the source of all those mortgages which are owed on British territorial properties, but not on American properties. It becomes apparent why there has been such a concerted effort on the part of the British territorial U.S. government to misidentify Americans as British territorial U.S. citizens. They get to collect mortgages and property taxes against U.S. citizens, not Americans. Likewise, while Americans may owe them for stipulated services, they owe the Americans an insurmountable debt, requiring them to provide a debt swap credit exemption exchange with Americans, but not with British territorials. This provides another powerful incentive and motivation to secretively impersonate and misidentify Americans as British territorial U.S. citizens. There are millions upon millions of Americans who have been secretly mischaracterized as British territorial U.S. citizens, Americans who have been impersonated and who have paid mortgages they didn't owe, property taxes they didn't owe, internal revenue taxes they didn't owe, and franchise taxes they didn't owe, all because of unconscionable citizenship obligations that were foisted off on them while they were babies in their cradles. If the purpose of the current action of the U.S. Supreme Court is simply to narrow down the competition to fleece the Americans out of more property, and to shut down the municipal courts in advance of another unjustifiable assault on us by territorial carpetbaggers, then the end of agency oppression will be tempered by the onset of territorial courts engaged in illegal confiscation and asset stripping, similar to what went on after the so-called American Civil War ended. We have discovered plans outlining such an assault on American homes and land holdings, and also plans by the U.S. government corporations to hold vast numbers of trials and executions at public expense, actions that will kill large numbers of people, create untold social upheaval, and further traumatize the American victims of all these crimes, without, however, coming clean about what has happened here. We strongly oppose and object to any such destructive course of action from persons who remain our debtors in fact. Issued by Anna Maria Riesinger, Fiduciary, the United States of America, in care of Box 520994, Big Lake, Alaska, 99652. Thank you for helping to restore the constitutional republic one county at a time.